Hello, welcome to Culture Hash. Today we're going to talk about the debut album from 17-year-old singer-songwriter Billie Eilish. The title is When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go? A good question, and sadly after listening to this album I don't really have an answer for where we go when we all die, but it's an enjoyable project nonetheless, even if we don't find out the answers to what happens to us in the afterlife. So, the first thing to note about Billie Eilish is that she's very young. She was born towards the end of 2001, which makes her 17 years old. Probably the youngest person's music I've reviewed on this channel, and it makes me feel a bit sick that people born after 2000 are having their own lives. It makes me feel very old and inadequate, really. Billie's got a great vocal range, but often adopts a moody, half-song, half-spoken approach that's very reminiscent of Lana Del Rey, who is one of Billie Eilish's biggest influences. Billie Eilish rose to prominence in 2016 with the viral smash Ocean Eyes. Ocean Eyes was a dreamy electropop ballad which was written and produced by Billie's brother Finneas O'Connell. The siblings have a strong creative partnership and write and produce all but 2 tracks on When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We All Go? And those 2 tracks in question were entirely written and produced by Finneas O'Connell. The sounds we hear on When We All Fall Asleep are primarily electropop. There's quite a few ballads on here. There's a few hip-hop touches to the production. There's quite a few slowed down poppy ballads, but the electro core is central to When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We All Go? The influence of Lana Del Rey on this project is significant, especially in Billie's vocal delivery. There are tracks like All the Good Girls Go to Hell, where the Lana Del Rey influence is very strong. I like this track because Billie's got a bit more energy on here. Her singing's full of attitude and she talks about how she's different from all the good girls that are just eventually going to end up in hell. And the attitude and delivery feels very much inspired by Lana Del Rey's music. The instrumental also heightens this comparison. It sounds like something out of a 1950s or 60s Americana style musical. The same can be said for the instrumental for the track 8. But on the track 8, the vocals are quite different. The effects on them give them quite a high-pitched, childlike quality. The influence of Lana Del Rey can also be seen on the single Wish You Were Gay. Wish You Were Gay is quite a moody ballad, and I wasn't really a fan of this track when I heard it as a single, but hearing it in the context of this album actually makes me appreciate it a bit more. It fits in with this moody, atmospheric style that Billie has across the album. The instrumental features a nice piano progression, and there's some big, booming drums that emphasise the chorus. When I first listened to When We All Fall Asleep, I was expecting a collection of gloomy, downbeat ballads, which made the opening track, Bad Guy, a nice surprise. Bad Guy is a disco and house influenced electro pop banger. It's got a massive bass line and a really catchy riff that makes it a lot more fun than a lot of the music that I've heard from Billie Eilish so far. Bad Guy is a track where Billie just says that she's a bad guy and she's all edgy and stuff, and it's good fun. It's a nice way to open this album, and it shows that Billie can make music that's a lot lighter than some of the more somber and serious moments on this album. There's a nice transition into a hip-hop influenced section towards the end, a beat change if you will. It works quite nicely here. You Should See Me in a Crowd also has a significant hip-hop influence. You can really feel it when the bass thumps, and I really like how it plays in with the scatty, trap-inspired drums that punctuate this track. I like how she gets across her rebellious attitude on this track, and it just feels really hip-hop inspired, goes really nicely towards the start of this album. You Should See Me in a Crowd. When the Party's Over was the track that catapulted Billie Eilish into mainstream success. If I'd have never heard of Billie Eilish and listened to When We All Fall Asleep without knowing which tracks were singles, I never would have picked When the Party's Over to put forward as a single to launch Billie Eilish's career. But the track performed well in the UK singles chart and peaked at number 21. But it surprises me that a slow, downbeat track like When the Party's Over is something that launches the career of someone who's quite young and is seen as quite edgy. Like the other singles we've already heard, When the Party's Over works quite nicely within the context of the album, as we know what Billie is sort of going for with her overall atmospheric and gloomy sound. This is also true for Bury a Friend, but Bury a Friend's a bit more fast-paced and is sort of like a quiet banger. Bury a Friend's got quite muffled drums and interesting effects on Billie's vocals. It sort of reminds me of early Alt J when their music would be quite quiet and they wouldn't use their bass drum. Bury a Friend isn't that extreme, but it's quite a quiet song, but it's also got quite a nice groove that makes it quite danceable as well. The final track I want to talk about is My Strange Addiction. My Strange Addiction is probably the most hip-hop moment on this album. It's got some DJ Mustard style synths that punctuate the instrumental. There's a prominent vocal sample from the US Office that sort of heightens the track here. I quite like how Billie's voice just like plays with this instrumental and it suits it quite nicely. My Strange Addiction is definitely one of the highlights on this album, and I like hearing the extent of Billie's vocal range within the chorus. The verses are quite downbeat and Billie's voice is quite low on these points. My Strange Addiction is very enjoyable. It's followed in the track list by Bury a Friend, but after that, the final 4 songs are very dreary, boring ballads that we've heard before, and the only thing that really makes these tracks interesting are the flourishes in the electro production that's underneath them. These final 4 tracks are a streak of just dreary ballads as the album quietly fades away and just quietly dies off in the corner. A couple of times when I've listened to it, I didn't even realise it ended because the final 4 tracks just all sound like one long continuous song. I mean, some of the pianos are quite nice and there are some interesting electro flourishes during some of the instrumentals, but for the most part these final 4 tracks are quite forgettable despite being somewhat saved by the production. But aside from these interesting moments in the instrumentation, the final 4 tracks just fade off and the album just ends quite badly in my opinion. These are tracks like Listen Before I Go, I Love You and Goodbye. But for the most part, When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go is an enjoyable album. It's a nice debut album from Billie Eilish. As you'd expect from a debut album of someone so young and fresh to the music industry, Billie wears some of her influences quite closely in her style, most notably in the vocals, which can at times sound like Lana Del Rey, but it still makes it an enjoyable project. Towards the end, the album gets quite boring and it just sort of fades off, but it starts strongly with tracks like Bad Guy and You Should See Me in a Crowd. On the whole, this is an enjoyable album from Billie Eilish. Billie Eilish, When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go is worthy of 6 out of 10.